I'm going to move on to assessing methodological limitations in primary studies. And already there's a key take-home message that these different stages are not necessarily distinct, and you can go backwards and forwards quite a bit between selecting and sampling, as well as assessing methodological limitations, because there may well be a case that you'd want to know about the quality of the study in order to select. So there aren't these discrete stages in a qualitative evidence synthesis. You can move backwards and forwards quite a bit. So I want you to open up your minds and brains to assessing methodological limitations. It's one of the things that's the most controversial in qualitative evidence synthesis. It's probably something that's done the most badly at the moment. And I want you to open your minds to thinking about it as a more holistic process that is very important. So let's look at the terminology to start with. So you might have heard it called quality appraisal or critical appraisal. In the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods group, we like to call it assessing methodological limitations in the primary studies, because that's exactly what you're doing. In most systematic review organizations, assessing methodological limitations in the primary studies is seen as an essential step in the systematic review process. And why is that important? Because those methodological limitations could impact on the interpretation of findings and what they mean. By undertaking the assessment of methodological limitations, you, as a reviewer, you're further engaging with the study to better understand its conduct and reporting. So it allows you to read the study, reread it, get to know it. The process provides more understanding of study relevance and conceptual richness and data thickness of the study. So it gives you a lot more grounding to what you globally think about a study. And as I said, the assessments can contribute to whether you decide to include or exclude. But controversially, if you speak to a lot of primary qualitative researchers, they can be a little bit negative about the process, that there isn't a good way of assessing methodological limitations. I think that the methods are progressing, but another key take-home message is there's currently no tool that's entirely fit for purpose within a systematic review process. So you need to bear that in mind. So as we've said, and as Andrew Booth has said since 2007, that critical appraisal, or the assessing for methodological limitations, is not a perfect process. And Andrew has said many times that it's a flawed technology with limitations surrounding the paper itself, the appraisal instrument, and the appraisers, either collectively or individually. So all those components bring biases to the process. To the danger reported by Sackett of critical appraisal nihilism, the perception that no paper is ever good enough, we add two further dimensions: no instrument is good enough and no appraiser is good enough. So sometimes we can be very harsh on primary researchers, and that we tend to use the opportunity to trash their papers. So I think you need to start off with the position that it is difficult and challenging to conduct qualitative research, and there's no such thing as a perfect study. So what you're looking for is a sort of an objective process, but that you're using your judgment. And for that, you need to have some experience of being a qualitative researcher, so that you're not being overly critical. So I'm going to signpost you to some additional resources, because we can't cover everything in these reasonably short webinars. We've written a series of papers published in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. One of them is on methods for assessing methodological limitations. We've also got chapter 21 in the main Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions. We touch on assessing methodological limitations there. And also, we've had mention already of the grade Cirquel assessment for assessing confidence in synthesized findings. This is the the grade equivalent for qualitative research. Many of you will know about the grading of recommendations, a group that Andrew and I have been part of, and Kate was also part of the process for developing this tool, have developed a system, an approach to assessing confidence in synthesized qualitative findings. Now, you get a whole webinar on this, and Megan Wainwright, who's an expert trainer, will be facilitating that webinar later on next year. But the important thing is now that you'll see that the first component is making an assessment of methodological limitations. And so I'm going to go through the process of how you would do that within a systematic review context. I think somebody else also picked up on one of the other components, which was about the adequacy of data component and how does that reflect on saturation. Well, the adequacy of data, just to touch on that point now, you would look to make an assessment of your adequacy to make sure that all your perspectives that were actually identified for your review question and your inclusion and exclusion criteria were covered in the data. So, for example, if it's about views of mothers and fathers' perceptions of childbirth, and you only had mothers' perceptions and no father's perception, then your adequacy component would be downgraded because you haven't got all the perceptions there. To the person who brought up the thing about data saturation, it's part of the adequacy assessment, but it's not all of it. So I would recommend that you tune into the Grade CircQual webinar on that so you can learn all about it. So today I'm going to focus on the component which is a methodological limitations component. And there is a paper. So we have a series in implementation science on the whole Grade CircQual methodology. Paper 3 is how to assess methodological limitations. It's an excellent paper. I recommend that you read it. So let's go back to some basics. So we like to talk in the qualitative world about risk to rigor. That's what you're looking for. We like thinking about rigor, how rigorously the research has been conducted. And that sort of broadly equates to the common terminology in the quantitative paradigm, which is around risk of bias. So there is a Cochrane risk of bias tool, but there's not yet a Cochrane risk to rigor tool that is in development. And I shall tell you a little bit more about that later. So here in the table, there are some comparative terms. So for example, truth value, the qualitative term is credibility, the quantitative term is internal validity. In terms of applicability, the qualitative term is transferability, the quantitative term is generalizability. Consistency, the qualitative term is dependability, the quantitative term is reliability. And in terms of neutrality, the qualitative term is confirmability and the quantitative term is objectivity. So they map on, but they're actually assessed in different ways. So my next slide is looking at credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Those really important conceptual domains when you're looking at qualitative research and thinking about rigor, because we're trying to assess risk to rigor, which will allow you to identify the methodological limitations in a primary qualitative study. And on the sort of right-hand side of the box here are some of the techniques and tips that you can use when you're reading a primary qualitative study to try and identify whether the authors of the primary studies have reported any evidence of credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So I haven't got time today to go through all of these in detail, but these slides will be up on the Learning Live website. So please go back and have a look at them so that you can use them as reference in future. So I'd like to move on to going through the different stages of appraisal. And this is where I'd like you to really open up your minds. So the assessing methodological limitations involves 3 stages. All right, so you might have only thought it covers 1 stage, but actually it's 3 stages. So already in stage 1, you're filtering against a minimum criteria. involving adequacy of reporting details. So you need a well-reported primary study optimally, but you don't always get it. So for example, often your exclusion criteria will sample out or exclude qualitative studies which are descriptive papers, which haven't got enough information reported, and there's some very badly reported studies out there. So you may well find that even by looking at your exclusion criteria and the types of studies that you want to include, you've already set a minimum threshold of quality of the sorts of studies that you want to put in or potentially include in your evidence synthesis. The second opportunity to undertake an assessment of methodological limitations is the technical appraisal of technical rigor of study elements indicating methodological soundness. And I'll show you what that's all about in a minute. And then the third element, which is probably the least well represented in the whole process, is the theoretical appraisal of paradigmatic sufficiency, which refers to the researcher's responsiveness to the data and theoretical consistency, and also the choice of methodology that the researchers have chosen in the primary studies. And for this, you do need an understanding of primary qualitative research. So let's look at the technical appraisal stage to start with. So many of you will be familiar with this particular stage, and you might think that this is the only assessment of methodological limitations, but it's one of three stages. So you would use an appraisal instrument to look for indications in a study that add up to the level of methodological soundness that would give you a degree of confidence in the researcher's competence to conduct research following established norms for the paradigm, and that's being qualitative research. So that needs a general understanding of qualitative criteria, and that's usually the checklist approach. The theoretical appraisal stage is where you tend to use your judgment, which looks at an evaluation of the methodological coherence between the theory, the methodology, and the methods to evaluate the quality and rationale of the decisions made. And as I said, this needs a more in-depth understanding of qualitative research. And if you have a very good, well-conducted, theoretically sound qualitative study, primary study, it tends to be very rich, conceptually rich, with very thick data. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So let's think about selecting an appraisal tool. As I've said already, there is currently no tool that is entirely fit for purpose. We've ended up in a very unfortunate circumstance with qualitative evidence synthesis. We've probably got about 140 tools to choose from. They've mushroomed. There's been an industry in making them, but none of them were, only a couple were designed primarily for to be used in qualitative evidence synthesis. So here's a bit of guidance for you. We would suggest that you choose a tool that's used in a recently published qualitative evidence synthesis, that's available online and ready to use, is broadly applicable to different qualitative research designs, unless you're doing a qualitative evidence synthesis that only incorporates one qualitative research design and there's a method-specific appraisal tool. Choose a tool that's developed and supported by an organization or an institute or a consortium, so you hope that there's some evidence-based development behind it. In chapter 21 of the Cochrane Handbook of Intervention Reviews, in chapter 21, we've outlined some criteria of which to assess a tool. At this point, I would like to give you another take-home message, is that there is a complete difference between assessing reporting quality and assessing methodological limitations. So there are reporting guidelines and checklists to assess how well a study is reported. So CORAC, the consolidated criteria for reporting qualitative studies, would be an example of a guideline where you could actually check the reporting quality. We're looking at the moment to identify a checklist to appraise the methodological limitations, which of course you need a well-reported study, but the appraisal that we want to do right now is one of methodological limitations and not of reporting quality. So Andrew has very kindly developed some further criteria for selecting a tool. Again, there are 14 criteria here, so I'm not going to go through them all. And this is another slide to come back to that you can have a look at in more detail to make sure that when you select an appraisal tool, that you're doing it with some thought to it and you're selecting an appropriate tool, whilst bearing in mind that we don't have a fit for purpose tool at the moment. So I'm going to show you one tool, which is the Critical Appraisal Skills Programme Checklist for Qualitative Studies. This is 10 questions to map against your primary qualitative study, and you answer yes, no, or uncertain, and there are a series of hints to consider when making your assessment. And you need to read the primary study very carefully and to make these judgments for each question based on the hints and tips. And again, you do need some experience of qualitative studies to do it. So it starts off, for example, question 1, was there a clear statement of the aims of the research? And then you have to consider what was the goal of the research, why was it thought important, and what's its relevance? And then you say, you know, you can make your judgment of yes, no, or can't tell. So those are the first 4 questions. Then 5, 6, and 7 and 8 go through more of the methods, such as was the data collected in a way that addressed the research issue, through to was the data analysis sufficiently rigorous? Is there a clear statement and findings, and how valuable is the research? So you would actually use those 10 questions to make an assessment of methodological limitations. Just one example of one tool. Now, the CASP tool is an example of a tool that does meet the criteria that we've set in chapter 21 of the intervention handbook. So it is a tool that you can pick off the shelf and use. It does meet all the criteria. So let's look at undertaking a theoretical appraisal, because this is probably the stage that you're least familiar with. So the theoretical appraisal, as we've said, is about making an assessment of methodological choice and coherence, the development of theory or new theoretical insights and the coherence of that, and the conceptual richness and data thickness in the primary study. And helpfully, Heather Ames and colleagues have developed an assessment framework for assessing the richness of the primary study. This is from the table here is taken from their original paper, which comes up with a richness score between 1 and 5. Other study authors, including myself, we've condensed this to 3 levels now to make it easier to apply. We found it quite hard differentiating between 5 levels of data richness in a primary study, and we've sort of condensed it to 3. And I will flag a little bit later on some of the things that do show whether a study is theoretically appropriate or not. So just thinking about undertaking the assessments, it does require considerable skill and experience of qualitative primary research. It's a consensus process. It's not an exact science, as individual judgments will vary. So that's an important take-home message as well, that you might all not think of the same methodological limitations in the same way. The process is undertaken by more than one person who resolve disagreements by consensus. All right, so we're looking at a consensus process, and a third person can arbitrate if 2 people cannot resolve the differences. So the overall assessment should then bring together the technical and theoretical appraisal within the context of how well the study is reported. And if there's time, because we know that reporting is often an issue when you're doing these assessments, review authors can contact the primary study authors to clarify information not reported or is insufficiently reported in the primary study. So let's quickly look at some methodological issues picked up by the appraisal process. So this is something that Kate and I have put in a paper recently. You might not find the question might be clear, or there's no question in terms of the methods, which would be the theoretical coherence. The methods might not be a good fit for the question. No method is articulated, or a reporting guideline is inappropriately cited as a method. the name method is not used or applied as originally intended without sufficient justification, or sometimes without any justification, or there's little or no evidence that the selected method was actually used in reality. Or, for example, participants do not consistently represent the population of interest, or there's been inappropriate choice of theory, conceptual framework, or that might not be applied. So there's all sorts of things that you can look for, which are common issues that can be identified in primary studies as part of the appraisal process. It's important to think about reflexivity in the primary papers, and the reflexivity of the authors often isn't reported at all. So you might have concerns about threats to rigor and conflicts of interest of the primary authors that haven't been made transparent. Again, you can, if you have time, contact the primary study authors, but often you don't have time. So we are learning to report studies more appropriately and more transparently, but you often have to learn to appraise studies that have not been well reported. When you report your assessments, there are some key take-home messages here. So do not score domains and report a total score, as this is considered meaningless. Not all the domains of quality are equal, so a sum of the scores is completely meaningless. Don't create scales of quality such as high, medium, low based on counting the domains, because not all domains of quality are equal. The most important factor is to identify concerns about methodological limitations in the primary studies and how they may impact on findings of the primary study and the synthesis, and transparent reporting is key. So I've put here a table from the grade circle process. So this is, you can see that they've used a modified CASP here. They've reported on the CASP domains, whether they're yes, no, unclear. What they have written why, what the methodological limitation is, and at the end they've got an overall assessment of moderate concerns. Sorry, I've gone forward there, of moderate concerns as their overall assessment. To this, I often add another column here and put my theoretical assessment of theoretical adequacy, and I would add that judgment into whether there were any concerns around methodological limitations. So transparent reporting is the really important key message here. So in using these assessments, you're using them as a way of engaging with the paper and its findings, which is familiarization, which is often the first point in the synthesis. Again, we've talked about deciding on inclusion and exclusion and purposefully sampling. Aspects of the process involve data extraction, because you often have to extract out all the characteristics of the paper in order to do this. This feeds into the grade circle methodological limitations component. All your concerns about the primary studies you would store onto one side. All the primary studies that contribute to a finding, you'd then go back and look at whether you got any concerns about those methodological limitations and make an overall judgment about concerns. And then you would think about whether those concerns impact on the development interpretation of the synthesized finding. So I'd just like to very briefly talk about our ongoing methodological work to develop a tool that is fit for purpose. This is called our Camelot tool. We're in the sort of early phases still of development. We've done a systematic mapping and a systematic tool, and we're using an evidence-based approach to developing this new tool, so that will actually be the tool of choice for use with grade circle. So keep your eyes out for new developments in this area. So that's where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to pause for questions.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Jane. There's been loads of good questions coming up in the chat box, as you wouldn't be surprised. So just a couple of them. I think you may have covered off one of them, but I think it'd be helpful to get some additional explanation. So this is one from Jen Francis, who was talking about, who had posed a question before he started speaking, and then has followed it up about reaching saturation and stopping including further papers, which can then directly impact on the adequacy rating or indeed coherence if you hadn't stopped including the papers. And so Andrew and I have been having kind of conversation in the chat box around that, and actually about actually looking at the end to see whether or not the areas of your phenomenon of interest or the particular scope of the review that maybe if you'd stopped including papers are a little bit thin, and then you could purposefully sample for that afterwards. And there was a question then about actually, is that a systematic approach? And we've been talking through, actually it's about kind of justifying your approach and describing it, and making sure that, you know, all those bases are covered. I don't know, that's probably not a question, Jane, particularly, but just kind of telling you what's been happening in the chat. I don't know if there's anything in particular you'd like to add to that.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the challenges for review authors is there's no one right way to do this, and it's about selecting the right approach for your particular review and review question, because the amount of available studies varies so much between review questions. Sometimes you have too many studies, sometimes you have too few studies, and you're choosing a review methodology that can only accommodate so many studies. It might be more flexible, or it might be more restrictive in the number of studies that can actually be accommodated. All of these are team decisions, and they need to be made transparent. And another team that came along afterwards might actually choose a different approach. It doesn't mean to say that it's wrong. It's what you're doing at that time for your review.
That's great. Thanks, Jane. And Theresa Moore's just asked a question. Do you ever do a sensitivity analysis to see the effect of removing data for those studies you're less certain about?
Yes, I saw that question, Theresa. I think that's a great question.
So, it is, isn't it?
Yes, we do. We do a sensitivity analysis quite often. Sometimes we can do it for other reasons other than we can think of a tipping point, and it comes back to sample selection again. Is there a tipping point at which you include one more paper and it doesn't actually change anything? And so you can think about it in those ways. We also do a sensitivity analysis if we want to think of whether, for example, a perspective that you've added in changes the finding. And so you can take that perspective out and see if the finding still holds or not. So I gave the example of father's views and mother's views. So you could have a composite view, and then you could look just at mother's views and just at father's views separately to see whether there are differences, because what you are looking for is diversity. And of course, in qualitative research and qualitative evidence synthesis, there are bound to be multiple perspectives that lead to different interpretations. And the important thing is that we are interpreting the data as the participants have said it, not the way that we want to interpret it from a professional perspective. So as Jenny Pope would say, we are privileging the subjective meaning of the participants, which is, again, a qualitative research technique.